All right, welcome everybody. It's been a bit of a slow week with the July 4th holidays here in the United States, but this week we have some internal topics that we want to move forward. Here, the user feedback initiative, we've been really happy with progress that we've made in not being the blocker in enabling user feedback. Building out some process, building out the infrastructure for gathering user feedback, and most notably, we've helped the tooling group led by Christopher Hiller of IBM. He's the lead maintainer of Mocha. Bone Skull is his handle. So Christopher Hiller's been great and bringing tooling forward and taking the sort of aggregate understanding that we've gathered amongst the tooling developers and carrying that back. Organizing that and carrying that back to the technical steering committee to influence decisions. Initial workflows appears to be taking RimRaf and some of the common modules that just have to get included everywhere in building everything. Sorry. Tierney or Michael Dawson are probably joining. Hi.
That's me.
My goodness. Do you want to end the meeting? Are you comfortable shutting everything down? Hi, Tierney.
Hey.
So in that light, we're very interested in seeing if we can't replicate that. Seeing that if we can't replicate that. So let's we have a few guests today, and let's take a second to introduce everybody. I want to make sure that in particular our guests sort of get introduced. So I'll be quick. Dan Shaw, the champion for user feedback. Mihai, why don't you introduce yourself, and Tierney real quick, and then we'll let our guests have the floor.
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Mihai. I'm a project manager and member of user feedback group since November. Yay!
Woohoo!
Woohoo!
Woo!
Yeah.
And
Tierney.
I'm Tierney Cyren. Yeah, I'm Tierney Cyren, developer advocate at NodeSource, chairperson of the community committee, and a user feedback member.
So, Ahmed, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey, everybody. Ahmad Nassri. I am the principal architect at TELUS Digital in Canada.
Awesome.
Looks like we have Mr. Dawson here as well. Then Benjamin.
Yeah, hi, I'm Benjamin Gruenbaum. I am a core collaborator. I also do other stuff in Node, like moderation. And basically, we did a lot of interesting work on promises in the summit, which has been very fruitful so far. And one of the next steps we want to take is to survey, to use foundation tools to survey the user base about how people use promises. So that's why I'm in the meeting, I think.
Great. Jordan?
Hi, I'm Jordan. I'm on TC39, and I talk a lot on GitHub. And I think the topic I was invited here around is promises and stuff around debugging.
Yep.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
You bet. And I saw that Michael Dawson just joined. Michael, do you want to introduce yourself to folks?
Sure. I'm Michael Dawson, member of the TSC and active in a bunch of the different working groups, as well as the user feedback working group here. So.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm promoting folks to co-hosts. For some reason, I wasn't able to promote Ahmed to co-host, and so I just kind of stopped doing it. That option is not available for some weird reason.
Possibly because I'm on Chrome OS.
Ah, interesting. Right. So your operating environment doesn't have the ability. So you're welcome to turn on video if you want. Reminder to everybody that we stream out our meetings to YouTube, so we will be immortalized in the internet. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Let me repost the meeting issue for today, so everyone has it. Right. So let's set the stage a bit with promises. So at the Berlin Node.js Collaborator Summit, bunch of folks got introduced to user feedback as an initiative, and we invited folks to come and participate. One of the most active groups and organized groups, it was the group that Benjamin had around promises, and kind of like to set the stage with promises to get an understanding of like where we are with promises and what the desired outcome the Benjamin and maybe some of the other promises representatives would like to achieve and get feedback on.
So basically, promises at the moment, have a bunch of usability issues, and the debugging experience isn't exactly where we want it to be. And basically, one of the things I've done before the Berlin meeting was to survey some people and try to get a better understanding of how the community has been using promises. And another thing that we've done is that we got a bunch of people together who have different viewpoints around what our APIs and what we should do can look like, which is really good. It's something I really hoped would happen. And one of the next steps we want to take is to try and survey the community to understand, we have several technical options and we have discussed the implications of implementing them. And I think at this stage, we want some feedback from the community to better understand what users are expecting in certain patterns, namely what should unhandled rejections do and what the default behavior should be. And also what sort of patterns people are using and what pitfalls they're running into, because we have some interesting conclusions from the research we've done so far. And at this point, we want to validate it against the larger Node.js community.
Great. Jordan, did you want to jump in on and add anything there? I almost immediately reached for yes, we could standardize APIs, but are there any sort of promises standardization workflows happening in standard space? Maybe you could fill us in on that.
Sure. So I don't know of any standards work currently being done that would impact the debuggability story around promises. I think in more general terms, I think what I feel like I've seen a lot is, so the statement that was made earlier that the debug, it was actually something about like debuggability is not where we want it to be. That's a fine statement. But what I usually hear is from folks in Node Core primarily and almost exclusively is that debugging promises is terrible and has always been. And that was a large part of the reason for the pushback against, like, you know, there's been a lot of pushback in Core historically about promise-based things. But I don't feel like anyone outside of Core or many people outside of Core have really shared that opinion. And I don't think there is a huge debuggability problem with promises. This comes up a lot around unhandled rejections, for example, like the desire to exit the process when there's an unhandled rejection, things like that. So I don't think anyone would argue with let's make debugging anything better, right? And async code inherently is harder to debug than sync code. So like there's always something that needs to be improved there, and any work that we can do to improve it should be considered. But I think that there's often a picture painted that things are on fire, and that I don't really feel like that's the case, and I don't feel like I get that sense from non-Node Core developers who use promises and asynchrony.
So for what it's
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just gonna say, you know, having talked to my coworkers who go on site to large enterprises and deal with people using promises, it's not necessarily, you know, in my experience, having talked to them and what they've conveyed to me from that experience is that it's not necessarily user code, it's third-party code, and you don't, when you're pulling in a bunch of modules, you can't guarantee that, you know, they're handling promises appropriately. And so that makes it a hard story. And so that's kind of why I think there's a part of a push at, you know, the node level to do that. That's just been kind of what I've heard. Does that make sense? Does that kind of fall in line with your experience or anyone else's experience here?
I mean, what you said makes sense. Certainly, if you're pulling in modules that are using code that are writing subpar code, then your experience is going to be impacted. But like, I feel like there's a pretty big leap from there to say that, like as it relates to unhandled rejection and exiting the process, even though I don't think anyone's proposing that happen immediately anymore. But like, I think there's a big gap between other people's code can misbehave and let's violate what I argue is the intent of the spec to like kill the process immediately when there's an unhandled rejection. And so I feel like I've been reacting to what I see as that large gap between here's a problem and then someone folks assume that this is a solution, but the solution is burning more bridges than it's saving, in my opinion.
So I can, I share a lot of, Tierney's experience, mostly out of proximity, right? You know, Tierney's the company that I created. So, I've definitely seen that. And, adding to what Tierney said, it's often the practitioners that are tasked to sort of, get code unmessed up, and promises code, tends to exacerbate that situation. The immovable point that I've seen around promises have come from teams that have gotten to a point of getting enough of observability in their systems, through callback wrapping and various other techniques, and trying to re-implement those sorts of techniques in promises where the world has fundamentally changed. The wrappability and the introspection that we can get with other techniques.
Great. So I just want to add that generally I agree with Jordan, and like things are not on fire, and like moreover, I think things are way better than they were, and part of that is like work project collaborators put in. And then another big part is that the VA team has been like very cooperative and pretty great in like taking the feedback we give them seriously and improving things in the engine. Like one of the things they're doing for us now is async stack traces in production. And then like the ability to inspect the stack in production is I think a big improvement. Now, while things are getting better, and like in my just my opinion is that they are already a lot better than they were with callbacks, at least for the big crowd. And like I validate that with some surveys I've done, which were like a lot less representative than the survey I'm hoping to get. But like the fact things are getting better, I don't think they're getting better like as quickly as they should have been. Like I try to like monitor the promises tag in Stack Overflow. So like there are things I see that are getting brought up a lot. And we are asking the V8 team for their time in implementing stuff. And they've already started like implementing different warnings and like things that are opt-in for us, which is very generous of them to like dedicate their time. But I really want to make sure that we're not wasting their time on things that like are my intuition or like another person's intuition, which is why I think it's really important that Jordan is here, because he has a different opinion about what the behavior should be. So I really like Jordan. I really like your help in like working on this, and I think the next step is to like try to figure out good questions to ask, and like we would really love your guidance in that, and like to get that survey out so we can like bring it up in the meetings we have with the VA team and like try to implement the stuff that users find more painful.
They're going to cross the streams a second and drag Ahmad into this. Ahmad, as you know, someone who's representing kind of the folks in the enterprise sphere, and has large deployments of Node, is our promise is a problem. Start with just kind of the broadest question.
I think I don't really hear too much complaints or see kind of situations where like our deployment or our application development is affected by that. But I think it only becomes a problem in the context of inconsistencies and in the context of debugging, as we said. I mean, it's not great, but again, I would echo the point. It's not a burning problem. It's just not really the nicest thing a developer has to do in terms of debugging issues when they have to deal with code that's mixed between promises and non-promises, especially when it comes down to the native Node APIs.
Right. So let's talk about in the meeting issue. I dropped in the DNS promise-fied APIs. So Core is beginning to experiment with these things. As someone who's not following that day to day, Michael, maybe you could update us on what the current approach the TSC is having to dealing with the promise-fied APIs.
I mean, I think at this point it's sort of in an experimental state where we're adding, or different people are adding a couple. So far it's FS and DNS to sort of experiment and get a feel for what works or what doesn't, as a prelude to maybe making a more organized effort to cover the broader surface area. I mean, my understanding of the discussion around the debuggability is that the challenge is, before promises, if you had an unhandled exception, it was pretty easy to track that down because you could, basically set it up so you got an exception when that happened. In the case of promises, because of the way unhandled rejections are spec'd, that's much more difficult. So, if people especially the people tasked with, tracking down, say, intermittent or production problems, we're used to that tool, which they had that was, that they found pretty effective, of, getting a core dump and being able to look at the stack and then going back to the developers. Not having that is is a challenge for them. And it's that maybe that it's not the developers that end up having, the people who wrote the code in the first place that have to face the problem. It's the operations team that needs to do that. But I also agree that, breaking the spec is not the obvious choice either, right? So it's trying to figure out what will let people debug and identify the location of those problems while maintaining, compatibility where needed.
So just like about that, one of the things like that I've been seeing is that very few people like when I ask people the question, like which is easier for you to debug, like promises, async functions, or like plain promises without async await, or callbacks. Like almost everyone in the crowd said, like I can pull the data, but almost everyone in the crowd said that like async functions are easier to debug than callbacks. And then like promises were about as hard for the people that I questioned. And this is like another thing that we can ask, because like very few people, it's very predominant in core, but like I don't feel that this is the case for a user base. Actually use core dumps as part of their like debugging process. They use other post-mortem analysis tools.
I guess it's the kind of debugging, like and we'll just need to make sure we have questions when we go out to capture who we're talking to, because I've seen quite often, the broader, it's in a lot of cases, it sounds like the broader set of developers don't have to debug those issues. They're not the ones pulled in to debug the issues in production. So we may talk to, a large portion of the users, and it's like, well, it's no different because they're not actually the ones who have to debug those kinds of problems in production.
Right. That's a good question.
So when we talk to them, they're going to say, like you said, well, actually they're doing a different kind of debugging. So maybe the async ones are easier in that context, right?
Right.
So it's just a matter of understanding, like, is the, and you could be right. Like maybe it's that, it's not an issue, but I think we need to get the right people answering as opposed to, or to be confident that we're asking the right people the question before we decide that it's not. That's all.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
So, Benjamin, what are the things that distract from a meaningful discussion around promises?
So I think there's actually a bunch of like interesting discussion going around promises right now. Netflix have committed to spend development effort on getting like the post-mortem debugging story better, and we're having like meetings on that, and we like things are moving, not like very quickly, but they're moving. So that part is working well. And then like we want to get to a point where we are comfortable like with the debugging experience people have. Now, that isn't to say that like debugging promises is easy or hard, but it's like it's what people are using. Like promises are reflected at this point, and we need to improve. Like because there was so much resistance over so much time to promises in core, a part of that reflected on that we haven't spent traditionally a lot of time, like as a project, discussing like what the debugging experience should be. There have been certain individuals that have spent a lot of time on that, but like we haven't done the discussion as a project. So we are starting like to get some discussion going, and like just the fact that the three people here have very different experiences that are like all valid about how people are using like how people are trying to debug promises is just like a stronger indication that like the data would be very useful. In trying to better understand. And then like Michael's point about having to make sure we capture the right audience, that like we don't just get people who are building APIs, we also get like the people who are on call that need to debug stuff in production. It's also like a very good point we should focus on.
Right. So I guess the thing that I'm probing for is in getting establishing signal around promises, do we need to avoid or embrace async await?
I think we need to embrace async await. Now, this is like it's an opinion. It's like it's a very maybe one would say, a pretty strong opinion, but it's like just my opinion. Now, like my initial like thought process would be, okay, I'll go and advocate for doing it, like optimizing for async await and not like regular promises. And this is not like to say we shouldn't support regular promise usage. We should, but like our focus when improving the debugging experience of developers should be async await. And to my surprise, this is something that no one has objected to so far. So I'm just going to go with it. And if either like anyone here thinks that like our focus should be on improving the debugging experience of raw promises over async await, then like that's also something we should ask.
So yeah, I think that async await is promises, but it's not even all of promises. It's like async function, I think, is awesome, right? Because it's a static way to guarantee that a function returns a promise and never throws. But await, I find to be actually terrible in practice. It's overused easily. People will. It's very tempting to accidentally create a serialized set of async actions when most of them could be parallelized. In other words, the advice I give people is don't ever chain your promises. Make each promise be a separate variable. And then when you're done, you can combine things into chains if it makes sense. And then everything that's a chain, you can write with in terms of await if it makes sense. And and my experience is if you follow that order where you don't type await ever until the very last step, then you end up with maximally parallelizable or concurrent code, and avoid like accidentally chaining things that don't need to be chained. And so I guess I'm kind of mystified how, like, I don't actually understand how you would be able to optimize async await in like I'm sure there are some things the engine could do that it could do that it wouldn't be that it wouldn't apply to normal promises because it's syntax. But I'm confused why it would be hard to optimize both at the same time.
Right. Right. And that's a good question. So, like you said, like async await is promises. You await promises, like async functions will invoke return promises, and it's like always the same native promise. Now, this gives, like, if I understand correctly from Benedict, like from the V8 team, like an easier path towards like providing useful debugging experience about the promises. So I'm not like saying our APIs should be async await focused, and I definitely agree that people like serializing their actions by mistake rather than running them concurrently is a problem. It's like something that's happening. But like when V8 asks us where they should spend their time when improving developer lives in debugging promises, like we want to optimize the common case, like what we think most of our users are doing. So basically, let's say you have async stacks. You have the ability to like pause a function in the debugger, or like after the like postmortem after the process terminates, and you can inspect like each step in the async stack. So, for example, providing that for promise chains might be more challenging to like the compiler. So this is not like a functionality thing; it's like a debugging experience thing. And we can tell V8 you should spend like equal time, or like that the feedback that we're giving is that using promises without async await is as important to provide useful debugging information for. But like if we get a limited amount of their time, I'd rather them focus on solving like the more common issue rather than the rare one.
Right. Well, just real quick, I mean, I understand what you're saying about the debugger itself. Like if you are only dealing with async functions and, that call into other async functions, but many promise-based APIs are not implemented in terms of async functions, and await is just promise.resolve around the thing you're awaiting. And moving on. So like, if you don't provide a way to debug async stacks with regular promises, then people who are trying to debug their async functions are going to find that a magical and undeterminable subset of their async operations can be stepped through in the debugger, and the rest cannot. So I think that that real promise chains, like regular promise chains and async await, are so inextricably coupled that if you provide a debugging experience for one and not the other, it's actually going to be subpar. Because I agree that most developers are typing async await at this point, and they think of it in those terms. And I was laughing earlier when they said that debugging promises is hard, but debugging async functions is not, because they're the same. But like,
they use the same underlying construct of a promise,
Right.
that like the async functions are not necessarily like because it's a subset, like you said, it's like a subset that's easier to solve. Like
Sure.
it's true that it's subpar to provide like debugging experience for async functions and not like promises in general. But the question is it like, is the limitation severe enough to not spend 20% of the time on like 80% of the game?
Benjamin, Jordan.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm gonna pull you guys back. So the point that I wanted to get to was as we look towards getting user feedback and developing out a survey, I actually think this depth of esoterica and discussion and understanding that both of you have is going to be the single hardest thing for you to set aside and distill down questions for usable data. So, one thing that you're going to have to decide in, asking folks about, promises, for example, is how much you want to ask folks about async await, and how much in that you're going to want to ask about, sub permutations of, the technical approach. Michael, you had a comment on this?
Yeah, I think one of the key things kind of related to that is that when we say debugging, it's kind of an overloaded word. I think part of the idea of like narrowing it to async await is that one of the problems is with the unhandled rejections in the spec allowing you to add something at any point, a handler at any point. If async await, it's deterministic. You can deterministically decide whether there's a handler or not. That's a case where it may be that you can do something better for async await than the general case. In what was mentioned though, in terms of the stack traces and that kind of debugging, like trying to look at the flow, those, maybe there isn't a difference, right? So it's kind of teasing out where what kind of debugging we're talking about, and in which cases then does it actually make sense that one, you could do a better job than the other kind of thing.
So drop the benchmarking working group survey into the chat. I invite especially Benjamin and Jordan to have a look at that. In terms of questions asked and different approaches. I felt like we got some of the best and most interesting answers out of the open feedback sessions. It's an interesting, in constructing a survey, it's an interesting balance between, laying out, 3 or 4 different choices that folks have to choose from, and providing opportunities for open feedback. So I think the next step for the promises folks is begin to sketch out some of the rudimentary questions, and I'm happy to put that workflow in our regular team meetings. So we're helping encourage and develop that along, through our user feedback sessions. Does that sound like a reasonable next step?
Yeah.
Awesome. So when you're ready, invite you to create an issue inside of user feedback and begin brainstorming on some of the questions. There's really no limit on how many questions or what type of questions you can ask. We can provide the infrastructure for as elaborate as you want it to be. yeah, there's some existing signal in benchmarking that may be interesting as well. And at this point, our next meeting, next general session, sorry, we have a general feedback meeting in 2 weeks. Next is sort of internal team meeting would be in 4 weeks on August 3rd. So we can reconvene then and bring that forward. And in terms of timeline for realization, I think having something that we put together and submit at the beginning of September, when folks are back from summer holidays, it would be good timing for that. Are there any impending deadlines that we need to think of? Is there? We have LTS for 10 going into effect. Is there anything like trying to get squeeze things through in a 10 release that we're dealing with?
Nothing that is going to be turned on by default. We have a feature that we think we are going to backport to 10 and maybe even 8, but there is not, we don't want to change any behavior in 10 at the moment.
Okay.
At least I like.
So the impending thing. I was going to say the impending thing might be preparing something for 11 at that point.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Okay. So I want to make sure we get some some time with Ahmed, and Ahmed has a hard stop at the top of the hour. So let's shift gears in addressing the enterprise user feedback. Like I said, in 2 weeks we have general user feedback. So would appreciate outreach and inviting folks to that. So where's do you have an issue for it? I don't know that we have an issue for it. General user feedback on Monday.
On Monday 16.
Yeah, there is an issue open for that.
Okay, great.
Just needs an agenda, that kind of stuff, but it is opened.
Okay. Maybe I'm not seeing it, so maybe someone could drop that in chat. That'd be awesome. So after that, we have a enterprise user feedback session penciled out, and what we wanted to do is see if we could have Ahmed organize that and begin to sort of take on the enterprise group and pulling that together. So that would look that would be on the calendar the week of the 17th, week of the 13th, if we give ourselves the entire spectrum of the week. Or should we wait until after August?
I don't have any issues with the dates, unless there's some activities going on around those.
Okay.
What was the exact date? You said the 15th?
So the exact date would be the 17th, though we talked about moving things off Friday since Friday afternoon presents some issues, and this would be noon on Friday for anyone on Eastern time.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have a problem with that week if there's no restrictions.
Ahmed, do you have any inclination of whether Friday at noon Eastern would be better, compared to any other date or time during the week? Day or time during the week.
My only feedback on that is, depending on the kind of action items you want to drive, doing something on a Friday presents less of an opportunity for a follow-up the day after, because people want to enjoy their weekends, especially in the context of the enterprise folks. If we're bringing people in to take part of activities, then I'd want to see an opportunity for them to follow up. But that doesn't mean we have to change anything now. On Fridays seems to be a recurring date that we can continue relying on, and then maybe in the future we can look at it.
We were already talking about moving it off of Fridays for the summit.
Yeah.
I think it was more like, is there a problem with moving it off? Fridays was.
Was the problem with moving it off? No, I think it's probably for the better.
Right. Yeah. So just the feedback of why it's on Fridays. Fridays is the reason why it's on Fridays now is largely out of my convenience, and Friday is a time that I can consistently carve out to do open source work. So that's why these sessions are scheduled for Fridays. But in driving the tooling group forward, Christopher had the same consternation. This isn't a great time for him and the folks that he's trying to pull together. So I'm open to finding the right time. It looks like the calendar is open at this time on Thursday. That would give folks the Friday to do the follow-up stuff.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Okay. All right, so we'll pencil in Thursday, August 16th for public session on enterprise feedback.
So what time was that on Thursday again?
That would be noon Eastern time on Thursday.
I'm just checking what time the TSC meetings is on. I'll say Thursdays. Okay, so and you said August 16th?
Right.
The community committee meets at noon on Thursdays. So I think that would be Tierney and myself would have it, and even yourself, right?
It's every other Thursday.
Right.
Every other
Thursday.
Thursday.
Calendar, it's not.
It is on the 16th, though. Maybe not.
No, we're not.
Nope. Okay, good.
It's an off week.
Okay, sounds good then.
Great. Okay. Great. So we'll. Great. Okay, so that is set up and we're good to go. So that's great. And Ahmed, if there's anything around promises and what folks are doing with promises that that you would want to weave into that discussion, I think that would be interesting perspective, because it has been some of the bigger enterprise users that have been the voices that have drowned out some of the other more positive voices around promises. So if we can bring together some perspectives from the enterprise on promises, I think that'd be nice to do.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an opportunity there. I would want to also be careful of, when we say enterprises and understanding a little bit more about the use case, because you can like I was looking at the survey numbers that was shared earlier, and it'll be interesting to know, like, okay, a lot of people are using X, Y, and Z and are relying on certain features and certain things, but what are they actually doing with it? Is it bots? Is it healthcare applications? Is it customer data management, or is it simple APIs? I think that's the missing context. So especially in the idea of, if you're looking at an enterprise voice, that's all fun and well, but if let's just hypothetically say there's a pushback against the promise conversation, but it's all about developer tooling rather than production systems.
Right.
That does help kind of clarify exactly where the kind of the interest lies, as opposed to if we come back and say, look, there's production level kind of systems that are running that actually this does impact and this does affect in one way or another. That's a different conversation than saying, our build tools are not as, supported.
So we were able to get some signal around, like, is it a microservice? Is it an API? That level of granularity. I don't know how we would, apply that out, since open-ended, really doesn't get the same sort of statistical roll-up that you get with, having some sort of an option there. I'm not sure how we would, go and build out that second layer of categorization.
Yeah, I don't know if I have an answer either. I'm just thinking in the context of if we look at these type of data and these type of numbers, we're not adding context behind it to actually know what is this product or a microservice that you're building driving? Are you just doing some hello world APIs, or are you building, really important business kind of drivers? It does help shed a light of what is the actual value being presented here. And again, I don't know how to actually roll that information in, but I think that's a missing part of that survey. For example, if you look at some of the survey numbers, how many people use what libraries? Okay, but what are they doing with them?
Yeah. There's some components that are specific to the enterprise, like the rating of the data that you're transferring and the importance of that data.
Like, look, for example, at question 5, what are the top 5 node modules people use most often? Number 1 is, or at least in the top 5, is Bluebird.
Right.
That's an interesting context to exactly the conversation around promises. But the question is, what are people actually doing with Bluebird?
Right.
Are they using it to run promises and logic through it, or are they using the utility functions that it provides? And also, to your point, what is the data being run through it? Is it just, configuration? Is it developer tooling, or is it actual data processing?
So I think specifically in the context of, like, that's a good point. I think specifically in the context of promises and the performance working group and Bluebird, there has been like a lot of context around that, about like whether or not people actually care about like how fast promises are in Node.js and like how commonly they're used. And then like I think the fact which people are using Bluebird, which is unfortunate, like it's something I like as a Bluebird maintainer and someone who's been like involved in Bluebird since the start. I have a personal goal to get people to stop using Bluebird eventually. So like I'm very serious about like accomplishing that eventually. And so one of the things that survey is telling me is that people don't trust like the performance of native promises enough, and we have since like added a survey, like a warning in the I added the warning during the summit to the homepage of Bluebird about like measuring your code before assuming like native promises are slow, because there is a lot of like content online about that. And I understand why it would be very interesting to understand how people are using it. But I think the data is telling us, like specifically for the performance working group and specifically like seeing Bluebird there, I think it's telling us like a lot. And it can probably be explained better, but it's definitely like interesting data to me.
So I think in the context of like an enterprise feedback group and especially like looking to dive deeper on these things, this is like exactly the point you're making, Benjamin. Is like you can start with those data points, but then we can go even further. Like we can systematically look at, you know, the hundreds of millions of dollars of investment of infrastructure that we're doing, for example, here at TELUS, and what type of applications we're building, and the actual kind of level of products that we're creating, and deep dive into, okay, where exactly is Bluebird being used? Why is it being used that way? And what the actual business problem is it solving or not solving, perhaps? And in the context of the native approach of using promises and APIs, what's holding us back? Like this is where you can actually leverage the enterprise kind of world of actually getting the systematic data beyond just the user feedback, right? Like there's the user feedback that gives you the surface level, and then you can dive deeper and actually put a $ value next to those questions of saying, there's the opportunity in dollar value, there's the opportunity in market impact, there's the opportunity in digital transformation for businesses.
That's actually very interesting. It's something like I've always wanted to know, like how many, like when we make a call, like we want to spend, I don't know, like 100 hours improving the situation of X in Node. It's very interesting to know like how that translates to like saving money people who are using Node and improving their lives.
And that's where, like, coming back to the point about performance, like if all my usage of, I'm just gonna hit on Bluebird as an example. If all my usage of Bluebird in my application code is on machine learning and on data processing stuff, then maybe I don't really care about performance. That's just ETL jobs that are gonna run over time, and who cares? Versus if I'm telling you, no, like this is in my critical path of e-commerce and my critical path of application, production level applications that are serving millions of customers, then all of a sudden performance becomes the important part over, for example, debugging and syntax and workflows. And you can get that from enterprise feedback cycle, but then it also there has to be a structure around that so that you can facilitate that level of deep diving of feedback so that those companies can actually help give you that context in a meaningful way.
So one of the design goals of this, it's actually like, I'll keep it short, but it's an interesting story because like in a gist, Bluebird was designed to debug rather than to be like as fast as possible. There are things that can be faster in Bluebird, but are not because it would hurt debuggability. But I think we have an issue. It's like more of a community issue than a technology issue, where when you tell people something is like faster or fastest, even if it doesn't matter as much for the app, they are more willing to adopt it and like introduce it to the workflow. So I think it's more of a people issue than a like technology issue in this case.
Sure.
Yeah, I agree.
All the good ones are. All right. Well, it seems like we got our ducks in a row on that. Closure on the European user feedback session. Unfortunately, I lost out to Yang, the V8 team. So there was an option of low level what was it? Code reuse, and then low level debugging and V8 led by one of the leaders of the V8 team. So everyone followed Yang to the debugging session, and the user feedback session in Europe was very had very low attendance. That said, there was a crew from JS Congress with a K that did stick around, has a bunch of questions around user feedback, gathering user feedback, and the value of that. So we had a great discussion around that, and the outcome of the session was there's the V8 team is again up to no good, and they've invited everyone to Munich in February for the next iteration of the Diagnostic Summit. So there's a nice opportunity with that to do some user feedback and to sort of use the opportunity of having the folks that are engaged and interested in doing the improvements to our diagnostic tooling in Node, and spending a half a day or some time while we're there, gathering some feedback from end users. So positive outcome. Not quite the one that I was expecting going in.
Yeah, I think it's March now that they're talking about for the summit. But anyway.
Oh, good. That we may have influenced that date because JS Congress is in March, and getting those two closer together, since there was JS Congress in Munich and this event in Munich, bring those things closer together. So folks are able to participate more in their trip. Good stuff. All right. Well, I think we can wrap it up there for today. Thanks, Benjamin and Jordan, for bringing promises to the table here. Look forward to continuing to collaborate with you on next step. And thank you, Ahmed, for spearheading things with the enterprise group. And look forward to general user session on Monday, July 13th.
16th.
16th.
And I guess, Ahmed, if you want to talk or sync on setting up that next session, I think I somewhere in my emails have the list of attendees. If you don't have that, or people who had registered to do that, but anyway, just feel free to reach out to me if you need any help getting that set up.
Yeah, I will definitely be reaching back to you after this call and talk next steps.
Sounds good.
Appreciate that.
Thanks,
All right.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one. Happy Friday.
Bye.
Bye.